about the learner ecological model. An important person you need to know about is someone named Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Yuri was born in Russia, but he moved to the United States when he was just 6 years old. So, therefore, he pretty much is known as an American psychologist. He lived from 1917 to 2005. One of the most interesting things about Yuri Bronfenbrenner is that he is co-founder of the Head Start program here in the United States. And whether or not you're familiar with Head Start, it is a preschool program that is government funded, and it's generally targeted to what they consider to be anyone who is at a disadvantage for school. That can be economics. It can also be, if you have any kind of delays of any type, you can enroll in the Head Start program. And if you want to know more about Head Start, I know that Mrs. Hess and I did a whole podcast on it if you're curious about that. But I have very fond feelings about the Head Start program. And so I am really pleased that Yuri created and was a part of something like that. Important for this class is the fact that he created what's called the ecological systems theory. All right, so here's his systems theory. You maybe have seen something like this before in your psychology-related courses, but you have these 4 systems here, as you can see. We have the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem. So here's what's important about the systems theory. It's that every person interacts with these 4 systems. However, of course, my 4 systems are not going to look identical to yours, which are not going to look identical to someone else. Now, it's kind of easy for us to think about this as adults, but it's important as teachers that we remember that our students, no matter if they're 5 or 15, also have their own systems that are unique to them as individuals. So let's talk about each one of these. We start with the microsystem, smallest circle closest to the individual. So this is where the child has direct contact with things in his environment. Okay, so this might be direct relationships with their parents or their teacher or their grandparents or their siblings. Anything that they have direct contact with in their daily lives. Can also include things like what they watch on television, what they eat, what they play with, those kinds of things. Those are all part of the microsystem. Very active involvement, direct contact. All right. Then we have the next level, which is the mesosystem. The mesosystem is when you have connections between the structures of your microsystem. So you can see that on the examples. If I'm a student and my teacher has a conversation with my parents, that goes into my mesosystem. Yes, it involves me, but I am not directly involved in that situation, that conversation, that context. It's because I have 2 things that I usually have direct contact with, but those 2 things are interacting with one another. That's the mesosystem level. Okay, the exosystem. This is when things are happening that impact me, but the child does not have direct contact with whatever's happening, but it can feel the effects. I have there as an example, the parents' workplace. Okay, if Johnny and his dad is going to lose his job, that is absolutely going to impact Johnny's life. He's going to have changes. He's going to have things that he has to deal with about that, even though it's not happening directly to Johnny, and Johnny's never at the workplace. But there are effects of that they can feel. Okay? And then the last system is the macro system. This is the one system where it may look a little more common for each of us, but there are still definitely going to be variations. Cultural things that are happening, issues that are taking place in the world, customs, traditions, things that are just inherent to, our backgrounds and make us who we are. Those things, while I don't really have a say in what happens with some of those things, they ultimately impact me as a person. Okay? Right now, Donald Trump is the president. Whether it be you like that or you don't like that, doesn't really matter. that is impacting your life right now. If you go on a mission trip or you have families that live in other parts of the world, things that happen to them are impacting you. Okay? So, what I want you to understand is that as a student, they have all these layers of things that are happening to them all the time. We need to, number one, be aware of it. And number two, let it soften ourselves as we consider each of these students in our classroom. Sometimes I think as adults, we forget that these kids are just little people. Okay, they have things happening to them, things that are beyond their control, things that are impacting their lives, good and bad, that make them who they are. Okay, so just remember that these things that are happening on each level happen in such a way that they can have negative consequences for the kid or they can be positive. Okay, just as I gave the example about dad losing his job, if dad gets a promotion or a bonus, that's also going to impact the child. Or if dad takes a job in another state and they have to move, that is going to impact the child. Again, the child has no control over that. All right. Just an example that I like to share sometimes is something that happened with me and my son. When my oldest son wanted to be baptized, that was a really, of course, a big deal for our family. He and I had spent a long time talking about that, thinking about it, praying about it. And he decided that he was ready to make that decision. Well, my husband and I really felt strongly that I, his mom, should do his baptism. Well, at the time, we were going to a church that we don't go to anymore. It was several years ago. But we anticipated that there was going to be a problem with the fact that I was a woman and I was wanting to do the baptism. So, of course, we did speak to the leadership. It was a problem. Um, and it was a problem to the extent that we weren't even able to have the baptism at their facility, let alone do it during church time or whatever. But my husband and I talked about it, and we still felt very strongly that I should be the person that does his baptism. So therefore, we made the decision that we would have his baptism at my sister's house because she had a swimming pool, and it happened to be summertime. Now, all of that, I'm not going to lie, was a very emotional and hurtful experience for us. But my son didn't know any of that, right? All he knows is that we said to him, "Hey, let's have your baptism at your Aunt Lori's. That way, everybody can come, even people that don't go to our church, and we can make it a big deal for our family." That's what he thought. Everybody came. We had his baptism in the pool. It was awesome and something that I hope that he always remembers. But my point is in telling that story is that there was this whole layer of things that were happening. A little bit mesosystem because it was about things that were happening between his parents and the church he went to, but even more so probably in his exosystem. But he had no idea that any of that happened. And still, to this day, I've never told him that story. And so he doesn't realize the background that was happening around the time that he was having his baptism. But it absolutely directly impacted him in ways that he doesn't understand. Yes, because we changed the actual baptismal experience, but also ultimately, we chose to leave that church. Again, he doesn't know any of that, but it had an impact on him. So that's just kind of an example. But to me, it's just so important that we think about all of the layers of things that are impacting people and the students in our classroom. Okay, they are not all the same. They are not all identical. They don't react the same way. They don't have the same experiences. And as teachers, we just absolutely have to remember that they are unique individuals. Okay, so understanding all of that is important for setting the stage for the next slide, which is when we finally start talking about not just this theory, but the learner ecological model. And here's the model. There are these three concentric circles that cover each other like a Venn diagram. And there are three variables here: the instructional environment, the curriculum, and the actual variables of the student. And we're going to talk about each one of those more in depth here in a minute, but what I want you to notice is this star in the middle where all three circles cross. And as you'll see up there, I've identified that as the learner. For every child, you need to remember that they fit in the middle of all three of these concepts in your classroom. Hopefully, as I talk a little bit more about it, it's going to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so let's talk about the instructional environment first. Anytime that you are in an instructional environment, there are three things that are impacting it, okay? The amount of modeling that's happening in the environment. So are you a teacher that you provide a lot of examples and modeling of how this should be done? And are you clear about the expectations? And are you showing them what they need to learn or do? Or are you just kind of saying, here's what you have to do, now go do it? That impacts the instructional environment. The amount of practice you provide. Have you scaffolded it in a way that, the whole concept, I do it, we do it, you do it? Are you giving them that experience? Are you giving them time to practice the skills that you're teaching and learning? Or is it pretty much a little bit of a practice time and then they're being assessed? That's going to impact the instructional environment. And then thirdly, performance feedback is a variable. I'm sure when you think about some of your classes that you've had, you probably have times where you get lots of feedback from a professor and you're constantly tweaking your projects or implementing things that they've said to you or suggestions they've made, whether it be written in your actual assignments that you turn in, or maybe it's just verbal in the classroom, out of the classroom in conversations, whatever it is. But that's all feedback that's given to you. Are you a person that is going to give a lot of feedback consistently, or is it going to be more like, students don't hear from you, they don't really get a lot of feedback from you until it's time to take the test, or until it's time for grade cards or something like that, and then they get their grades? Okay, so all three of those things are going to impact the instructional environment. Next, let's talk about the actual learner. The child, her or his self, has variables, right? That's kind of what we were talking about on the last slide. First of all, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. This is a reading class, but it absolutely doesn't matter if we're talking about reading, math, science, cooking, sewing, anything, okay? For each learner, they're going to have a certain skill level when it comes to that concept that you're working on, okay? It is what it is. They either have high skill in being able to understand or relate to those concepts, average skill, or less than average. The strategies that they use to learn, solve problems, understand what you're trying to teach. What are the strategies they use? Now, you can apply that to the classroom for early childhood, middle school, and high school, but also just think about yourself. For some of you, you like to handwrite your notes. Some of you type notes. Some of you don't take notes at all. You just listen, and then later, maybe you print out slides and you write on them. I don't know what you do, but you have some sort of strategy that you've come up with whenever you are learning in a learning environment. Okay? And then finally, of course, is the student's motivation. We hope as teachers that we can be really motivating to our students and help them want to learn. But there are just levels of that sometimes we can't control, okay? Maybe, let's take my son. If he's learning science, super motivated, loves science, wants to learn a lot about it, really, really motivated to do well in that class. But if we're talking about something else, maybe writing, he's not as motivated because he's not as interested in it. So the interest is there. Maybe sometimes students start out really motivated because they want to do well, but then they get some really bad scores, and then now they suddenly lose motivation because they feel like they can't overcome that. Okay? Other times it's because they have these outside factors that we talked about in the last slide that are impacting their ability to really focus and put a lot of effort into what they're doing. But it's not always negative. Sometimes they're super motivated, right? You can be really motivated by a professor or a peer or the topic or what the outcome is because you're working your way towards something. At the time that I'm recording this, I am 3.5 weeks away from finishing my dissertation for my doctorate. Let me tell you what, I am super motivated right now to finish that thing. If I had worked as hard